with my near brush with death. I had a very bad cold. I try not to baby myself when I get them, but I didn't have a choice this time. My lungs were filling up, and I was pretty miserable. And I'm not completely well yet, but I'm working on it. Roy, it's on the steering committee. He's had this thing for about 6 weeks, I guess. So I feel pretty lucky to be feeling as well as I do so quickly. Tonight we're on step 7, and I think one of the first things we need to talk about, and over the years I've heard a lot of discussion, learned discussion in the around the tables of Alcoholics Anonymous, what the difference is between defects of character in step 6 and shortcomings in step 7. And I mean, I've heard some learned discussions on it, and I heard on I think it was a Joe and Charlie tape, that Bill was questioned as to what the difference was between the two, and he said the difference is simply this. When I was going to school and I was learning how to write, I was taught that you don't use the same word twice to express the same thought. So he used a different means of expressing the same idea. So we're not dealing with two different things. We're dealing with defects of character or shortcomings, whichever one you prefer, but they are one and the same. I think it was necessary for me to come to understand at some point in my recovery just exactly what defects of character meant. And what I came to understand was what character meant, and character is the sum total of my thoughts and beliefs and attitudes and how I project them outward from myself, and that is what was defective. It was wrong. It was out of sync. It wasn't like a normal person's character. I was known as a person of bad character. I was known as a person who could not be depended upon. I was known as a person who was insensitive and uncaring. I was known as a person who might be a nice guy to be around if you wanted to get drunk and act like a fool, but when that was over, you got the hell away, and you didn't associate with him again until you felt like getting drunk and acting like a fool. I never could understand why I had so many good drinking buddies and no friends. I could not understand why everybody's wife hated me. I could not understand how I could be held responsible for their husband's drinking habits. But lo and behold, even though I could look around and saying, this guy's getting drunk too, and he'll drink with me anytime I ask him, I was always to blame. And that was because, in everybody else's opinion, I had the most defective character. These other people may have drank too much, but they didn't have bad character. They could be depended upon if they weren't associating with me or somebody like me. So when I came to Alcoholics Anonymous, and I was through a little education and through a lot of guidance and assistance from a power greater than myself, able to achieve 1 day of sobriety, even though I was incarcerated to achieve it, I had to start to work unknowingly on trying to build something that I could come to recognize as good character, and that other people could come to recognize as a change in me. So that's what I've been doing up to step 11, is building blocks foundation on top of the rubble of the past. A foundation for a new life. I can't get rid of the rubble. My new life is built upon it. Was not taken away, was not hauled off and put in a landfill. I stand upon it tonight. The wreckage of the past. It's not troublesome to me today, but my life's built upon it. A long time ago, I wrote at the top of step 7 in my 12 and 12 that humility got me sober. And it also says in here somewhere else that humiliation precedes humility. So I was finally humiliated into humility. And it says that tolerance will keep me sober. So those are two key words. Humbly ask him to remove my shortcomings. Humility enables me to do these things. And tolerance of others will help me to live this change that I'm trying to effect in my character. Let's turn to page 70 and 12 and 12. It says, since this step so specifically concerns itself with humility, we should pause here to consider what humility is and what the practice of it can mean to us. Indeed, the attainment of greater humility is the foundation principle of each of AA's 12 steps. For without some degree of humility, no alcoholic can stay sober at all. Nearly all AAs have found, too, that unless they develop much more of this precious quality than may be required just for sobriety, they still haven't much chance of becoming truly happy. And I would like to read the back in the foreword of this book. It's not necessary for you to turn there unless you want to, but it's in the third paragraph of the foreword on page 15. It says AA's 12 steps are a group of principles, spiritual in their nature, which if practiced as a way of life, can expel the obsession to drink and enable the sufferer to become happily and usefully whole. So what it says, even if I can stay sober by one way or another, if I don't develop this thing called humility, that I cannot become truly happy. And the promise that these books make is that if I do these things, that I will not only become sober, I will no longer have the obsession to drink. This irrational urge to commit an irrational act, not only will that go away, but I will learn to live happily and usefully whole. I'll become a whole person again. I'll be able to have the three main elements in my life: family, work, and social. And that's what makes a whole person. And that those three things can be fulfilled in a number of ways. I'm not talking about traditional things. There's a lot of pieces of my life that a normal person or even somebody in the program can look at and say, I wouldn't want that piece of that guy's life, but it's satisfactory to me. I probably don't have a whole life in the traditional sense of somebody that grew up without a problem and without alcoholism or any other kind of problem and had one traditional marriage and a set of kids and a picket fence and all of that. But I've got a life today that makes me happy. And I don't make other people happy with it intentionally anymore. Also, so we're all talking about the same thing on this humility business back on page 58 in this book. In step 5, we've read it probably at least two times by now, but in case you weren't here to read it before with me or you forgot, in the first full paragraph there in the second sentence it says, to those who have made progress in AA, and we're talking about humility here, it amounts to a clear recognition of what and who we really are, followed by a sincere attempt to become what we could be. I have to remember who and what I am, and I've talked about that in this meeting, and I'm not going to go into it now. But this sincere attempt to become what I could be, that isn't a preconceived notion of what I can become or of what I can be. I have to do the work, and I have to meet my responsibilities, and I have to see what happens, and that's what I become. I didn't set out to become this. I didn't set out to become that. I just did what was in front of me, and it happened. And because I didn't have any preconceived notions and I wasn't making any demands, this thing that happened to me, this thing that I became, was acceptable to me. And we're going to be talking about demands in step 7 too. Back on page 70, the last sentence in that second paragraph, I think, is where we left off. Without humility, they cannot live to much useful purpose or in adversity. That means when things go against me, when things happen that I don't like, when things happen that I don't understand, when I don't know something. Without it, they cannot live to much useful purpose or in adversity be able to summon the faith that can meet any emergency. And if you want to know whether or not this thing is working for you, whether or not you're working hard enough for this thing to work for you, whether or not you've worked on it long enough for this thing to work for you, then you take a look at yourself. You have to take a look at me when things don't go my way. What do I become? Anybody can do well when things are going well. But what do I become when they don't go well? And what is the event when I conclude things aren't going well? Do I throw a fit when I have a flat tire, or do I change it? Do I get upset if a parent dies? Certainly. Does it ruin my life? Hopefully not. I do the grieving, and I move through it in a logical process, and I'm okay. So what triggers this adversity, is also an indication of where I am, and then what do I become. Humility as a word and as an ideal has a very bad time of it in our world. Not only is the idea misunderstood, the word itself is often intensely disliked. Many people haven't even a nodding acquaintance with humility as a way of life. Much of the everyday talk we hear and a great deal of what we read highlights man's pride in his own achievements. With great intelligence, men of science have been forcing nature to disclose her secrets. The immense resources now being harnessed promise such a quantity of material blessings that many have come to believe that a man-made millennium lies just ahead. Poverty will disappear, and there will be such abundance that everybody can have all the security and personal satisfactions he desires. The theory seems to be that once everybody's primary instincts are satisfied, there won't be much left to quarrel about. The world will then turn happy and be free to concentrate on culture and character. Solely by their intelligence and labor, men will have shaped their own destiny. Certainly no alcoholic and surely no member of AA wants to deprecate material achievement, nor do we enter into debate with the many who still so passionately cling to the belief that to satisfy our basic natural desires is the main object of life. But we are sure that no class of people in the world ever made a worse mess of trying to live by this formula than alcoholics. For thousands of years we have been demanding more than our share of security, prestige, and romance, demanding more than my share of security, prestige, and romance. When we seemed to be succeeding, we drank to dream still greater dreams. When we were frustrated, even in part, we drank for oblivion. Never was there enough of what we thought we wanted. And I love this in Bill's story. I'll read this. You don't need to turn to it. It talks about drinking more to see. We drank to dream still greater dreams. Bill's talking about Lois, his wife, is really concerned about his drinking, and she's talking to Bill and trying to talk some sense into him. And here's what Bill told Lois. He said, "We had long talks when I would still her forebodings by telling her that men of genius conceived their best projects when drunk, that the most majestic constructions of philosophical thought were so derived."
That's right.
And I believe that. I don't know how Bill stole that from me. I used to have all kinds of things that I thought I was that I wasn't when I was drunk. In all these strivings, so many of them well-intentioned, our crippling handicap had been our lack of humility. We had lacked a perspective to see that character building and spiritual values had to come first, and that material satisfactions were not the purpose of living. You know, they may well be for other people. I don't know. But I had my priorities out of order, and this is what this book says. I thought if I had this, I wouldn't drink as much. I thought if I had this, this wouldn't happen. I thought if I had this, I would be happy. If that would go away, things would be different. If she would shut up, I got my first wife shut up. She called me from Florida. She'd gone home to see her parents. And she called me and she said, "If you don't do something about your drinking, I'm not coming back to St. Louis." And I said, "Well, let's get off the phone. You're wasting time. I need to get in there and start packing your shit." I don't know why I even told that. Where was I?
Bottom of page 71.
Where?
Somewhere down here. Right here.
Oh, okay. Oh, that's why I told that story. I still must be feverish. Quite characteristically, we had gone all out in confusing the ends with the means. Instead of regarding the satisfaction of our material desires as the means by which we could live and function as human beings, we had taken these satisfactions to be the final end and aim of life. True, most of us thought that good character was desirable, but obviously good character was something one needed to get on with the business of being self-satisfied. With a proper display of honesty and morality, we'd stand a better chance of getting what we really wanted. So here I was, putting on this false front, trying to be something that I really wasn't, in order to manipulate people for me to achieve an end, not being genuine. And believe me, it didn't take people long to see through it. But whenever we had to choose between character and comfort, the character building was lost in the dust of our chase after what we thought was happiness. And the politicians, the pretty people, had got a buzzword for the politicians to use these days, and it's called situational ethics. Whatever the situation demands, that's what I'll be. I have no anchorage. I'll have no rock on which I stand. I'll be whatever I need to be in order to achieve an unworthy end. Seldom did we look at character building as something desirable in itself, something we would like to strive for when our instinctual needs were not met. We never thought of making honesty, tolerance, and true love of man and God the daily basis of living. You know, I thought if I had any time left over after I got through with all these other shenanigans that I'd work that in. You know, all that other stuff left, then I had to work this in on the front. This honest tolerance and true love of man and God. This lack of anchorage to any permanent values, this blindness to the true purpose of our lives, produced another bad result. For just so long as we were convinced that we could live exclusively by our own individual strength and intelligence, for just that long was a working faith in a higher power impossible. This was true even when we believed that God existed. Well, what this is saying is there in room for two gods in my life. If I'm thinking I'm God, the other one's out. The real one's out. When I think that I can force things to happen, when I think that I am in control of events, known and unknown, that affect my life directly and dictate to me what's happening, I'm playing God. And I start doing some things, trying to control these uncontrollable things that are going on around me. I lost my place again. This was true even when we believed that God existed. Does anybody have a highlighter so I can keep track of where I am? Thanks, Joe. This was, now don't laugh at me that hard. This was true even when we believed that God existed. We could actually have earnest religious beliefs which remained barren, which produced nothing, because we were still trying to play God ourselves. As long as we placed self-reliance first, a genuine reliance upon a higher power was out of the question. That basic ingredient of all humility, a desire to seek and do God's will, was missing. So this is what I've got to start to put into my life, this God consciousness that I talked about 2 weeks ago, that I was supposed to start to feel in step 6 when I followed the directions on the first 6 steps in the book Alcoholics Anonymous, this God consciousness. I was starting to feel I've got to start letting it operate in my life and manifest itself by seeking and doing God's will. How? By making honesty, tolerance, and true love of man and God my daily basis for living. It's like it says up in the top paragraph. For us, the process of gaining a new perspective was unbelievably painful. It was only by repeated humiliations that we were forced to learn something about humility. If I hadn't been pounded to death, if I hadn't been pounded to pieces, by this disease of alcoholism, I don't think I would have had much use for this thing called humility, because I would not have undergone the humiliation necessary for me to even attempt to seek it. It was only at the end of a long road marked by successive defeats and humiliations and the final crushing of our self-sufficiency that we began to feel humility as something more than a condition of groveling despair. And I guess, I labored for a long time about what does humility mean, and I could understand the intellectual explanation of humility, but I couldn't get this emotional thing of the meek shall inherit the earth, and and I just thought, well, I can't be that. But it was a misunderstanding of what humility was. It's a clear recognition of who and what I am. Every newcomer in Alcoholics Anonymous is told and soon realizes for himself that his humble admission of powerlessness over alcohol is his first step towards liberation from its paralyzing grip. So it is that we first see humility as a necessity, but this is the barest beginning. To get completely away from our aversion to the idea of being humble, to gain a vision of humility as the avenue to true freedom of the human spirit, to be willing to work for humility as something to be desired for itself, takes most of us a long, long time. To gain a vision of humility as the avenue to true freedom of the human spirit. And for you, those of you who were here when I talked about the Trinity of the human being, and I didn't say man out of deference to the ladies, of the human being, of the mind, body, and soul, and the mind being the spirit, and the brain. I called it the mind, the brain, and the body. But the mind being the spirit of the soul, and the brain being the computer that's a tool of the mind. What Bill's talking about here is getting my mind in control of my brain, this true freedom of my spirit, where I'm not into this self-will run riot, which is when my brain is running my life on the basis of stored bad data, repeating actions over and over again, expecting different results. Getting my mind back in control of my life, the true freedom of the human spirit. But it takes a long, long time. And I tell people this sometimes with reservation, and sometimes trying to create some reality, but it's my opinion, and from what has happened to me and what I've seen happen to other people. And I don't mean for this to discourage anybody, because we're talking about some lifelong practices. But if you're sitting there and you're sober and you're saying, I don't feel any of this, and I've been doing it, and I've been doing it for months, and I've been doing it for years, you don't need to get discouraged, because I believe it takes about 5 years of hard pick and shovel work before these types of things that they're talking about take place within my life to the point where I can recognize that I am truly a different person. And that not only is it something that I am not forcing myself to do, it's something that's happening to me. And it is something that is desirable. Up until that, about 5 years, I was still kicking and screaming, wondering why, and asking questions, and trying to learn and trying to get explanations that suited me, and reading in the big book what I wanted it to say, and hoping I could find a loophole, and hoping some psychiatrist would tell me something different, and hoping my wife would change her behavior, and hoping this and hoping that. And sometimes it happens sooner, and sometimes it takes longer, but that's what it says in the promises. Sometimes soon, sometimes longer, but it happens to us all. So, and the only reason I tell anybody that is don't give up. Don't wake up some morning and everything's going your way and saying, well, it's going to be this way forever, and I don't need to do these things anymore. Don't do that to yourself. Don't get disconnected with the fellowship. Don't lose the disciplines in your life that the program has told you to put into it. Because when adversity strikes, you're going to find out who you are. You can't fool yourself then. You're going to become the person you truly are. So, and if you're discouraged because some of these things aren't happening, don't give up. Keep trying, and it'll happen. It does for everybody who keeps trying. It takes most of us a long, long time, a whole lifetime geared to self-centeredness. Cannot be set in reverse all at once. Rebellion dogs our every step at first. And then up that at first, there's days, months, weeks, years, but it becomes different, as time passes, and I keep trying. When we have finally admitted without reservation that we are powerless over alcohol, we are apt to breathe a great sigh of relief, saying, well, thank God that's over. I'll never have to go through that again. Then we learn, often to our consternation, that this is only the first milestone on the road we are walking. Still goaded by sheer necessity, we reluctantly come to grips with those serious character flaws that made problem drinkers of us in the first place. Flaws which must be dealt with to prevent a retreat into alcoholism once again. We will want to be rid of some of these defects, but in some instances this will appear to be an impossible job from which we recoil. And we cling with a passionate persistence to others which are just as disturbing to our equilibrium because we still enjoy them too much. How can we possibly summon the resolution and the willingness to get rid of such overwhelming compulsions and desires? And that's a question, apparently, that's going to be answered here in a few minutes. But again, we are driven on by the inescapable conclusion which we draw from AA experience that we surely must try with a will or else fall by the wayside. Remember back in step 3, it talks about the proper use of the will. It says we either have to try with the will or else fall by the wayside. There isn't any standing still. Either I'm doing it or I'm not doing it. And if I'm not doing it, certain things are going to happen. And if I'm doing it, certain things are going to happen. And it's going to be two different things. I'm either going to learn how to stay sober successfully, or I'm going to go back and drink unsuccessfully. At this stage of our progress, we are under heavy pressure and coercion to do the right thing. And here it is. We are obliged to choose between the pains of trying and the certain penalties of failing to do so. The pains of trying and the certain penalties of failing to do so. You can't stand still. If you won't stand the pain of learning how to live sober, then you'll stand the pain of active alcoholism. That's what the book says. That's what's happened in my life, and that's what I see happening in other people's lives. Either I stand the pain and get well a little bit each day, or at some point I'm going to go back and do it. The initial steps along the road are taken grudgingly, yet we do take them. We may still have no very high opinion of humility as a desirable personal virtue, but we do recognize it as a necessary aid to our survival. But when we have taken a square look at some of these defects, have discussed them with another, and have become willing to have them removed, our thinking about humility commences to have a wider meaning. But this time, in all probability, we have gained some measure of release from our more devastating handicaps. We enjoy moments in which there is something like a real peace of mind. And, that's what happens in early sobriety and early meaning, whatever early means. It depends upon where I am in my spiritual growth as to what early means. But I will have some real peace of mind, and then things will go bad on me again, and then I'll have some real peace of mind, and those periods will be short at the beginning, and the bad times will be interminably long, and then I'll get it back, and it'll be a little longer the next time. But if I get it back because I'm doing the work, and I lose it, and I'm still doing the work, that's when I'm growing spiritually. But when I'm staying in it, and I don't get it back unless things turn out the way I want them to, and I'm not growing spiritually. To those of us who have hitherto known only excitement, depression, or anxiety, in other words, to all of us, this newfound peace is a priceless gift. And when I was talking about step one, I talked about this excitement, depression, and anxiety in that up and down chart that I drew, that emotional roller coaster type chart. And what Bill is telling me here, and you can draw your own conclusions, but what he's telling me is that I have a mental addiction to these three states: excitement, anxiety, and depression. And that when I'm not feeling one of these three, then I think something's wrong. And I'll do something to create one of these feelings. And I lost the ability a long time ago to get excited about everything. I've been to 3 World's Fairs and a couple of side shows, and I can't get excited about too much anymore, so I'm into anxiety and depression. And that's the way I want to think, because that's the way the disease tells me to think. And if I think the way the disease tells me to think, I'm going to end up drinking. So I've got to learn how to break this mental addiction. I've got to learn that when I'm not into one of those states, that even though I don't feel right, that nothing's wrong. And I don't have to go out and do something that will trigger an event or a situation where I can feel this anxiety or this excitement or this depression. But I really didn't have any need to have something trigger it. I just swung around in it like I was on some kind of a carnival ride. Just swung me over this way one day, and next day it swung me the other way. And I never understood what was going on. But what I was doing, I hadn't learned how to put my mind in control of my brain, and I was just sloshing around through life, stone cold sober. It's how a drunk lives, in this excitement, anxiety, and depression. And even though I was sober, I was still thinking that way. Something new indeed has been added. Where humility had formerly stood for a force feeding on humble pie, it now begins to mean the nourishing ingredient which can give us serenity. Remember, I believe it's in step 5 in the big book, it talks about being able to match serenity with calamity. This improved perception of humility starts another revolutionary change in our outlook. Our eyes begin to open to the immense values which have come straight out of painful ego puncturing. Painful ego puncturing. What's ego puncturing? Well, that means I got to listen to somebody tell me I'm not what I think I am. I'm not who I think I am. And I've got to listen. I don't have to like it. And it can kill me on the inside. But that's good. The more I suffer, the better it is. Until now, our lives have been largely devoted to running from pain and problems. Heavens, I didn't know that.